Chronic loneliness raises your risk of early death by 26%. That's higher than obesity. It's close to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And it's happening to people who look, by every visible measure, completely fine. This isn't a theory. It's the conclusion of the longest-running study on human happiness ever conducted, and it took researchers decades to believe their own data. Here's what nobody tells you about that number. It's not about people who are obviously isolated. It's not about the elderly widower living alone or the guy everyone already worries about. Some of the loneliest people in this research were married. Some had dozens of friends. Some were surrounded by people constantly and still felt like nobody actually knew them. That's the part that should unsettle you. Loneliness was never really about how many people are in the room. Let's go back to where this all started, because the origin of this study is almost as strange as what it found. It's 1938. The country is still climbing out of the Great Depression. A Harvard physician named Arlie Bach decides to try something nobody had attempted before. Instead of studying sick people to understand disease, he wanted to study healthy people to understand what actually makes a life go well. So he picked 268 Harvard sophomores and started tracking everything about them. Physical exams, family interviews, psychological testing, home visits where researchers watched how these young men interacted with their own parents. One of those sophomores was a skinny, sickly kid named John Kennedy. Another would grow up to run the Washington Post. Nobody running the study in 1938 had any idea they were sitting across from a future president. Nobody expected the study to last more than a few years. Instead, it's still running today, 87 years later. At some point, the researchers realized they had a problem. Every single subject came from wealth and privilege, so the results would only ever describe one narrow slice of humanity. So in 1970, they merged their data with a second study, this one following 456 boys from poor Boston neighborhoods. Suddenly, the study spanned the full range of American life, rich and poor, successful and struggling. 4 of the men eventually ran for the United States Senate. One became president. One became an alcoholic and never recovered. One case from that second group, the disadvantaged Boston cohort, shows exactly why this study became so important. A boy named Godfrey Camille entered the study with, on paper, the worst odds of anyone in it. He ate dinner alone every night until he was 6 years old. He struggled deeply as a young man. If you had to bet on which of the 700-plus subjects would end up broken by midlife, researchers would have put their money on him. Instead, at 35, something in him shifted. He became a psychiatrist. He took the neglect he survived and turned it directly into his life's work, helping other people who'd been failed the same way he was. By the time he was an old man, he ranked among the happiest, most fulfilled subjects in the entire 87-year dataset. His life is the clearest possible proof of something the researchers kept circling back to. By the time this study reached its 87th year, it had quietly become the longest-running study of human life in scientific history. And here's the question the researchers were really trying to answer. With nearly 9 decades of data, thousands of pages of interviews, blood tests, brain scans, and family records, what actually predicts whether someone ends up healthy and happy at 80 years old? The obvious guesses would be money, career success, intelligence, fame. This is where it gets uncomfortable, because none of those were it. The men who ended up the healthiest and most satisfied in their 80s weren't the ones with the most impressive resumes. Several of the study's wealthiest, most accomplished subjects ended up isolated, miserable, and in poor physical health by the time they reached old age. Meanwhile, some of the men who struggled financially their whole lives, who never achieved anything close to fame, were thriving in their 80s. Sharp minds, strong bodies, genuine joy in daily life. Researchers even found that a person's satisfaction with their relationships at 50 predicted their physical health decades later better than their cholesterol numbers did. The dividing line wasn't success. It was something almost nobody thought to measure carefully when the study began, because in 1938, nobody thought it mattered scientifically. It was the depth of a person's relationships. Specifically, it was whether someone had people they could actually be honest with. Not acquaintances, not a wide social circle. A small number of relationships where they felt genuinely safe being seen. The current director of the study, a psychiatrist who has spent decades reviewing this data personally, put it in blunt terms that shocked a lot of people when he first said it publicly. He said, "Loneliness kills." Not metaphorically. He meant it works through the body the same way a chronic disease does. And this is where the science outside the Harvard study starts backing this up in ways that are honestly hard to ignore. In 2015, a researcher at Brigham Young University pulled together data from over 3 million people across dozens of separate studies, trying to answer one specific question: how much does loneliness actually shorten your life? The answer she found was that people experiencing chronic loneliness had a 26% higher risk of dying early compared to people who felt genuinely connected. People living entirely alone showed an even steeper risk, over 30% higher. Not people who were medically unhealthy to begin with. Not people with dangerous habits. Just people who felt alone. To put that number in perspective, the United States Surgeon General later stated that the health impact of chronic loneliness is comparable to smoking up to 15 cigarettes every single day. Let that sit for a second. You would never let a friend smoke a pack of cigarettes daily without saying something. But we've built an entire culture that treats social disconnection as a private inconvenience instead of what the data says it actually is, which is a slow, measurable health risk. Here's why it works this way inside your body. When you feel chronically isolated, your nervous system doesn't interpret that as sadness. It interprets it as danger. Researchers who study the biology of loneliness have argued that this reaction is evolutionary, not psychological. For nearly all of human existence, being cut off from your group didn't mean feeling a bit down. It meant no one was watching your back while you slept. It meant no help if you got hurt, no one to share food with during a bad season, nobody to warn you if something was hunting you in the dark. Your body still runs that same ancient alarm system today. Loneliness triggers a low, constant stress response. Elevated cortisol, higher blood pressure, chronic inflammation that never fully switches off. Your immune system stays on edge for a threat that in the modern world usually isn't even there. Over years and decades, that constant low-grade alarm wears down the body in ways that look, on a cellular level, disturbingly similar to the damage caused by cigarette smoke. But here's the part of the Harvard research that complicates the simple version of this story, and it's the part almost nobody brings up. It's not about how many relationships you have. It's specifically about their quality. Researchers found that people with plenty of social contact could still register as deeply lonely on every measure the study tracked, if those relationships felt shallow, guarded, or full of unresolved conflict. Meanwhile, some of the healthiest, most content subjects in the entire dataset had a genuinely small circle, sometimes just one or two people. What mattered wasn't the size of the circle. It was whether, inside that circle, a person felt like they could actually be known. The researchers found something else that's easy to miss too. It's never too late to change this. Subjects who were isolated and unhappy in their 50s weren't locked into that outcome. Some of the men who rebuilt real connection later in life, even in their 60s and 70s, saw measurable improvements in both their health and how satisfied they felt with their lives. So why does this matter more right now than it did when the study started in 1938? Because the world has quietly become far better at making people feel occupied while making them less connected. You can spend an entire day surrounded by notifications, messages, and group chats and end that day having had zero conversations that touched anything real. Contact has never been easier to fake. Connection hasn't gotten any easier to build. Public health surveys now suggest something close to half of adults report feeling lonely on a regular basis, and it's not concentrated in the elderly the way you'd assume. Some of the highest rates show up in people in their 20s, the most digitally connected age group that has ever existed. If anything, all the noise makes it easier to convince yourself you're not lonely, right up until your body starts keeping score anyway. Think about the last time someone asked how you were actually doing, and you told them the truth instead of the automatic answer. If you had to think about that for more than a second, you're not alone. Most people would. That gap, the space between how connected we appear and how known we actually feel, is exactly what this 87-year study found quietly, deciding who lived longer and who didn't. The men in that Harvard study who ended up thriving in old age weren't the ones who avoided hardship. Many of them went through divorce, financial ruin, war, and illness. Godfrey Camille went through a childhood almost nobody would wish on anyone. What separated the men who thrived from the ones who didn't wasn't a life free of struggle. It was having at least one or two people they could turn toward when things fell apart, and who turned toward them in return. That's the part the data keeps confirming, decade after decade, subject after subject. Not wealth, not achievement, not how impressive your life looks from the outside, and not even a president was exempt from that rule. Just whether, when it mattered, someone was actually there, and whether you let them be. You already know who those people are in your life right now. The question this 87-year study leaves you with isn't complicated. It's just uncomfortable. When was the last time you actually reached out?